I am so pleased to be joined by the renowned pianist Craig Rutenberg, who has a new recording out. This is Virgil Thomson. Let me see if I can get in here. A portrait of a gallery of portraits for piano and other piano works. Where we're going to, first of all, welcome you, Craig, to Classical Conversations. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be here.
Well, there are so many portraits on here, some well-known names, some not as well-known names, depending on your level of involvement in the classical music world. But there are so many here. I wonder if you can talk about, well, first of all, let's talk about your relationship with Virgil Thomson. Who is Virgil Thomson for people who don't know?
Virgil Thomson was and remains, in my book, uh, one of the really great American originals in musical life of America in the 20s, 30s, 40s, really up through the 80s. He was also probably the finest music critic that we've ever had. That's not to put anyone else in the shadows, but Virgil, from through his very strong, very fine education at Harvard in how to write, really made words mean what they were supposed to mean, and with brevity. Yes, his reviews were frequently slanted towards the French rather than the Germans. That was his privilege. But Virgil was the music critic for the New York Herald Tribune from 1941 to 54. And I don't think we've really ever reached a level of straightforward communication about what a reviewer heard in a concert since then.
Mm.
So there was that. Of course, he wrote for many other publications as well. There were some terrific essays that he wrote over the decades for the New York Review of Books. He was a brilliant lecturer, and his musical aesthetic, along with that of his very good friend Henri Sauguet, was that, I guess you could say, as a follower of Eric Satie. Simplicity, a little bit of irony, certainly a great deal of sarcasm, but with an absolutely American touch.
Yeah. Can you talk about your longtime friendship with him and how that began and how it developed?
Sure, with great pleasure. In the summer of 1970, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. We're not in Germany, but New Haven was my hometown. And I had a piano teacher there called Paul Klein. And I hope he'll be able to listen to this when this is transmitted. Uh, he was a Yale piano student, very, very clever, very intellectual. And he had a postcard of a photograph of Gertrude Stein in a cabinet. And I looked at it. It's a rather famous photograph of her sitting in a chair. She's staring off to the side. She's wearing one of her great corduroy skirts. And I thought, wow, who's that? So I went out and I bought Three Lives, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and Lucy Church Amiably, and immediately became a Stein fan. So that's where the fascination began. That fall, I went down to Georgetown as a freshman to study German and Italian. But at the same time, there were a few music courses we could take. I was obviously a linguistics major. And Paul Hume, the great Paul Hume from the Washington Post, was teaching those courses. And I wrote a paper on Four Saints and Three Acts in that first semester. Of course, text by Gertrude Stein, music by Virgil Thomson. I'd known who Virgil was, but I was just getting to know the author, and I wrote a paper on it. And when he brought the graded papers back at the end of the semester, he said, some of these are very good, and one of them should be published. And I thought, well, I wonder who that is. Well, it was mine. It never got published. But Paul said to me, you really should get up to New York and meet Virgil. So a couple of months later, I was going up. It was the Easter weekend, yeah. And I was visiting my parents in New Haven. So I wrote Mr. Thompson a letter and explained what this was all about. And he wrote back immediately. He said, "Come and see me on Good Friday at 3 p.m." So I put on my best breeches of Georgetown white suit and a big bow tie. And I had a lot of hair and gold rimmed glasses. You know, it was the 70s. So I went off to the Chelsea, rang the doorbell, and it went from there. Um, so we talked a bit. We had a little exchange. Off the record later, I will tell you what what happened, but what I can tell from
Okay.
public consumption is that he got very annoyed with me about something. And I thought, oh, well, at least I've met him. So I got up and I put my jacket back on, and the apartment was on the ninth floor of the Chelsea, and there was a huge wooden door, two doors that opened, and an L-shaped corridor that went into the living room, the reception room. So I started to go out that way, and he came through the other corridor, and he said, "Well, for a kid, you got style and you got a lot of spunk. Stay." All right. He said, "I got to go uptown and talk to Mr. Roram about something, but you stay here. There's vodka in the freezer. It has buffalo grass in it, so it's Szubrovka, the Polish vodka. Of course, it turned out it was probably the kind of rot gut that you would buy at a gas station, but he put the buffalo grass in, and it tasted very good. And as he was on his way out, there were these enormous files on top of all of the bookcases. And he said, "Those are the letters from Gertrude and Alice and Pablo and George Braque and Stravinsky and all of that. And you may take them down and read them if you like. If I discover at some point that any are missing, I'll know where to find you." So I sat down on the floor with a large glass of the vodka and was very careful, but I got to read probably 50 of these letters and put them back again. And he came back from seeing Ned, and we went to dinner. And I kept calling my father on the hour, saying, "I'm going to be on the next train. I'm going to be on the next train." And finally, I got back around midnight, and that's how the friendship started.
Yeah.
After that, he suggested that I come up to New York long weekend every month. So I'd cut classes on Friday at Georgetown, and I'd get on the train and come on up. Actually, it was the bus because the bus was cheaper. And I'd get there around 11 in the morning. The first thing we would do was get a big old shopping cart and go shopping for vegetables and groceries and steaks for the weekend. And we'd come back, have a little lunch of some sort. He gave me lessons in harmony. He gave me lessons in copying music. He would listen to me play my piano pieces. And then he taught me how to cook.
Mm.
And of course, everyone in the world was coming through for dinner, everyone from François Safwan to Lenny Bernstein to the whole world.
Wow.
So for an 18-year-old kid, it was a real aesthetic shake-up and pretty damn wonderful.
Well, you've had a remarkable, life besides your association with Virgil Thomson. Getting back to the CD, I wonder if you can tell us about these portraits, because from what I've read, it was done like people came in and sat for a portrait like a painter
That's right.
would do. Can you explain that situation to me?
Absolutely. He got the idea, of course, from Elgar and Rameau and a couple of other composers in history who wrote musical enigmas or portraits of their friends. Virgil got the idea back in the mid-20s. It was around the time that Gertrude Stein, who had by then become a great friend of his, and they were colleagues, with Four Saints and Three Acts and a couple of other songs, Preciosidad and Susi Asado. And Virgil got the idea that Gertrude, who was writing word portraits of artists who were painting her, could possibly happen through his music as well. So I believe the first two or three he did from memory or just as a tribute to some friends in Paris. But then he got the idea that they should sit as if for a painting. And as far as I know, with maybe one or two exceptions, until the end of his life, when he was, well, what was it? Mine was written in 81 and he lived to 89. I think he stopped writing them around 85 or 86. I can't quite remember. But the deal was you would come to the apartment, you go to the apartment after lunch at the Chelsea, and he'd sit at his table. He had a long rectangular table, and that was both the workstation and the dining room table. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, everything would get cleared off, polished, cleaned, and then it would be transformed into the dining room if you weren't going out. And you'd sit there with a book or a newspaper, and he'd sit across from you, and he would just keep saying, relax, get rid of all of the armor. Just be yourself.
Yeah.
And I remember I was holding a copy of Pagany, a periodical from the 20s, which had the first printed edition of Four Saints and Three Acts in it. And it was rather fragile, so I was being careful, and I was reading it. And he was just looking at me, about 2 or 3 minutes, I think it was. I was trying not to be obvious in watching him. And then I realized his pencil came down to the paper, and he just started writing. And eventually he didn't look up at all. Wow. And after about 15 minutes, he said, oh, that's that. Let's go to the piano and see how it sounds. So that was my experience with it.
That's amazing. And yeah. It took him a while to come around and write a portrait of you. Yes, from what I've read. Yeah.
He did. He kept telling me that I had too much protection around me, and as much as he loved me, he couldn't see who I was.
Yeah. What a great experience. I mean, with all the other stuff that is involved with Virgil Thomson. I wonder, can you talk a little bit about, like, I see some of the names on here, and some of them stick out to me, they jump out at me. Others I'm not so familiar with. I'm struck by the idea of Pablo Picasso sitting for a portrait. Is that how that happened?
I think Picasso was one of those. No, he did sit. Of course he did, because it was just before Virgil left Paris after the Germans arrived.
Okay.
He did. But Picasso had worked on a cover for some printed music of Virgil. Oh my gosh, what they call Vals Gregorian, something like that. And so they were friends, and of course they've been friends through Gertrude and Alice as well. Yeah. So it's not that out of the question. And then because Virgil, was thinking, well, I may never get back to Paris again, he also did a portrait of Dora Maar, who was then Picasso's mistress. And while she was sitting, Picasso apparently came into the room just to see what was going on, and Virgil said invariably Picasso wound up in Dora's portrait as well.
That's so interesting. Some of the other names jump out at me, like Dennis Russell Davies, who is a conductor that I worked with quite a bit in my singing career, but he's also from Toledo. I don't know if you knew that, but he is. You did know that, yes. Of course, you know everything there is to know.
I most certainly do not, and I'm realizing that now that I'm in my 70s, I know that more and more. But Dennis was very good, has been very good about performing Virgil's music over the years, and I know Virgil appreciated that dedication to his music and the fact that he got to perform so often.
Yeah. I mean, you've got people like Aaron Copland and Lou Harrison, Dennis Russell Davies, and all of them doing something or some other phrase that's associated with them. Like Dennis Russell Davies is in a hammock. I don't know what the story is there.
He was in a hammock. They were off on summer vacation, he and Molly and Virgil. And I guess Dennis was relaxing in a hammock, so Virgil took out his paper and pencil and wrote a piece of music about that.
Yeah, yours is entitled Swinging, And I wonder
Yes.
if you can clarify that for us, because there are multiple ideas that can be associated with that word. I wonder which applies to you specifically.
All right. Well, I think that's okay to say on radio nowadays. When it first came out, Yuri Mills said to me, "Ha! You never swung a day in your life." Thank you, Miss Mills. No, I asked him about things. He said, "Well, you've always seemed to be a pretty cheerful guy to me." So, but what's interesting is the swinging slowed down. The original tempo indication for the metronome was daughter quarter 72, and then he slowed it down to 48.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah.
it took a transformation between the composition and when it finally got printed by Boozy and Hawkes.
Yeah. Speaking of printing, are all of these in print, or did you dig some of them up? I mean, what was the process?
It was a labor of love. A great deal of them were in print, and I think still are. Certainly those that were published by Boozy and Hawkes. Those are readily available. The ones that were published in the 40s, in the early 40s, Virgil became the most powerful music critic in New York and maybe the US. Then, of course, all of the publishing companies wanted his work. Prior to that, they had absolutely no interest, but now it was a big deal. And he was published by Century. Uh, those were published in very handsome thin editions. Those are long out of print.
Mm.
And I'd say about 30 of the portraits were still in manuscript form, which the Yale University Music Library provided.
Yeah. That's amazing. This entire album has got so many portraits on it, but it also has a couple of piano suites from music that he wrote for the stage and screen. I wonder if you can talk about those a little bit.
Right. Well, the film score for The Plow That Broke the Plains was the first music score to win a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
It's a great, great score. And if any of you listeners have a chance to see the film, it occasionally pops up on YouTube. It's just the most wonderful score and kind of defines American movie music.
Yeah.
When Virgil was writing these scores, there were several others. The Louisiana Story, for example, which also was just a brilliant score. He, as he put it, delved into several volumes of cowboy songs, Americana, uh, back to Sims that he knew as a little boy back in Kansas City, Missouri. And that was the basis for his that was his inspiration for the tunes, which he either used flat out or he modified with a certain bit of Satie-like irony. But it was a pleasure to play the piano score. I've done it in concert a couple of times, and people just
Yeah.
love it. And then also on there's some selections from the ballet called Filling Station, which was, I think, about the first real American ballet. It came 3 or 4 years before Appalachian Spring.
Wow.
And it's all about Mac, the grease monkey, as we used to call him. Do you remember that term?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, sure. I
Right.
don't think any younger listeners will know about that, but it's Mac the Grease Monkey. And it's an afternoon in a filling station, in a gas station. And people show up, a family of vacationers, and then some gangsters show up, and there's a shootout. And then eventually everything ends well, and the vacationers go off on their vacation, and Mackley is left to clean up the shop.
I think that's a brilliant premise for a ballet, right?
Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? Yeah. And it was conceived by and written for Lou Christensen, who most people may not remember nowadays, but he was head of the San Francisco Ballet after his career for years and years.
That's wonderful. I want to talk about you a little bit because you have played for, almost every famous opera singer. You're a much beloved figure, a collaborative pianist who has worked all over the world. How did you get interested in becoming a pianist and making your life about music?
It was always there. From I never knew a time when I wasn't fascinated by music. Growing up in New Haven, it was in an old German and somewhat Italian neighborhood. It's a sort of world that nobody can imagine nowadays if you weren't born in the 50s. And our next door neighbor was my mother's uncle. His name was Fritzie Keneal. And as a New Haven native, he had been pianist for Rudy Valley when Rudy Valley was at Yale. And he also played for these two sisters who used to come in from Meriden, Connecticut, called the Ponsillo sisters, Carmen and Rosa. Of course, Rosa became Rosa Poncell.
Right.
So back around 1913, 1914, Fritzie was playing for all of these people. So he knew about music. He started to teach me piano when I was, they tell me 3. I'd like to think that's a family embellishment, but whatever. I was certainly around the ages of 3.5 or 4. He taught me to read music, play, and all of that. And do you remember the Longines Sinfonietta?
Which Sinfonietta?
The Longines, as in the watch company. Does that mean
No,
anything?
I don't know them. Yeah.
Okay, even you were too young. Back in the 30s, the Longines Watch Company, like so many great American companies, had their own orchestra. They had a radio program and all of that. They were very, very good. We had at home a 33, so it must have been produced, 1953, 54. It was made of red plastic, and on it was Wotan's Farewell. So I was sitting in a room in the house listening to it, and I remember the music, particularly da, da, dee, da, 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 causing me to burst into tears from the beauty. And my grandfather yelling at my mother from another room, "Nimm das weg, etwas ist los mit dem Kind. Turn it off, something's wrong with the child."
Right.
Well, there was, but it was something that turned out to be good for me.
In a good way.
In a
Yeah.
good way, yeah. So Fritzie's sister, my grandmother, poor woman, had died rather young, 3 years before I was born. But in the house were all of these 78s of Flaxad and Björling and Swarthout, and so I used to play them all the time on the crank up,
Yeah.
the gramophone, and I developed a great love for the human voice. And of course, it was back in the days when people like Ed Sullivan had Hilda Guden, Risa Stevens, UC Björling, on the TV regularly. So that's what whet my appetite. And once Uncle Fritzie explained to me one day that there was such a thing as a répétiteur, they were called, and they worked in opera houses and they played for rehearsals and taught singers their music. Then I just went, now I know what I want to do with life. So that's how it all started.
I want to mention that this is coming out May 17th, right? And it's from Everbest Music label. They've done a couple of different works with the Virgil Thomson Foundation, right? And
Yes.
I noticed this cover photo on here, which comes from your collection, right?
It does indeed. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah. Can you tell us about your
Yeah, of course.
collection?
Well, it's only, I want to talk about that photo first because it's the only one of 2 photos I know of Virgil where he's smiling.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he always looked like the Grinch, a very unhappy Grinch in every photo which was taken. And of course, as he got older, the corner of his mouth went down and down and down, so he really looked mean and nasty. But that photo was taken by Eugene Cook, the Life magazine photographer, who was married to Phyllis Curtin, the great American soprano.
That's where I know the name. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
where you know the name. And of course, Phyllis was devoted to Virgil and his music, as was Betty Allen. But Virgil adored Eugene, just adored him, and was one of the few people who could really make Virgil laugh out loud.
Hmm.
So I don't know what was going on in that photo session. It looks like the early 60s to me, but whatever was going on, Virgil was clearly having a great time.
Yeah. That's opposed to this portrait that's in the book here of
Oh,
there he
yeah. I
is.
mean, that's what he looked like, until the very, very end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Is there anything else that you think our listeners should know about this recording before we let you go?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, I think 30, what's it now? 34, 5 years after Virgil's death, 35 years now. Yeah, he used to say that artists die, and then it takes about 3 decades for them to come back into some sort of favor again.
Hmm.
And I think this is a very, very good time for Virgil to come back into some favor.
Yeah.
There have been revivals of the operas over the years. Mark Morris did a very good abbreviated version of Four Saints. City Opera put on a wonderful production of The Mother of Us All some time back. Juilliard, just a couple of years ago before lockdown, did a sensational Mother of Us All as well. But I think it's time for the piano music and some of the orchestral music to get back out there again. So with the timing of this recording, it's I think it's important. I think everything is falling into place.
Yeah.
The other thing is my producer and technician did this as a huge labor of love. We had to do it over several sessions. Most of the sessions were done up at Ozawa Hall at Tanglewood. It was music that they didn't understand.
Hmm.
And I remember Jay Sack saying to me, I'm doing this because I trust you and because I really love you as a colleague, but I don't get it. I've spent my whole life working with music, which is about overt emotion. And I had to say a couple of times, the thing about Virgil's music is he wanted no emotion. He wanted expression, but no sentimentality.
Hmm.
And I was just talking to Jed Disler about this about a week ago, because Jed also plays his music and very, very well. And he said, I'm afraid I let my emotions get in there at some point. And I said, it happened to me too. And sometimes I would hear Virgil's voice in this ear saying, stop the damn emotion, just play it as it's written. And I'd call out to the guys and say, stop, we have to do it again. I'm sorry,
Hmm.
something's wrong. So that was a big part of it. It's an aesthetic. It's like listening to Satie. If you play Satie as if it were the slow movement of Scarpo or the piano sonatina, it doesn't work. It's
Yeah.
got to be straightforward. It's got to be what we say in Yiddish, tisch. You put your tush on the table, like when you're tallying up cards at the end of poker. Time to tell the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fabulous. I mean, there's so much here to delve into and to talk about, but I think definitely Virgil Thomson's piano music is in good hands with this recording.
Thank
Um,
you.
I've
I
always
hope so.
admired your piano technique and the way that you're able to make great music out of pieces that are a minute long. It's really quite an accomplishment here. The album is called Virgil Thomson, A Gallery of Portraits for Piano and Other Works. I'll get it there
Yes.
in the camera. Coming out from Everbest Music on their label, and that is happening in just a few days from the time that we're talking today. But Craig Rutenberg, wonderful pianist, thank you so much for joining us here on FM 91. And also, it's great to see you. I haven't seen you in a while, so it's great.
It's been a long time. It's wonderful to see you too. I missed seeing you on the quizzes since I'm no longer at the Met. It's super wonderful to hear your speaking voice again, and thanks for the kind words. I hope it does well. I hope that people get what it's all about, and thanks for your interest and your support.